Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Let's Eat. Today, we are exploring such an important topic in wellness, a relevant topic within our country, and one episode simply does not do this topic justice because of how important it is for us to understand how this is driving so much of our disease and really equipping ourselves with what can be done about it. What is encouraging and empowering is the fact that this is a reversible issue, that we can work on what we're eating, how we're living in relation to these issues and make a profound change in our health and then obviously how we feel as a result of it and prevent long-term disease as well. But the connection of this issue with neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's and dementia, with diabetes, with heart disease, with all of these issues that are rampant within our country is a very real thing. So I want to walk us through this idea of metabolic dysfunction or metabolic syndrome and talk about blood sugar, blood glucose, how to stabilize your blood sugar, what that means, why that creates issue and damage within the body, mitochondrial dysfunction, right? Like all of these concepts in a very simple, digestible way. And then also offer you tangible takeaways and strategies to address this issue. 93% of Americans are metabolically unhealthy. So this episode is relevant to 93% of the population. Odds are you fall within that category. Unless you take conscious effort to address your blood sugar and to look at these markers and really understand them, which I really hope that that's the case. That would be wonderful. But the likelihood of this being relevant to you and your life is likely, right? Because of the fact that 93% of Americans are navigating some sort of dysfunction within our metabolic health that needs to be addressed that can really make an enormous difference on our physical and our mental health. So welcome to the table. I'm so happy that you're here, and let's dive into metabolic dysfunction, metabolic syndrome, how it's driving disease, and what we can do about it. Welcome to Let's Eat. I'm your host, Emily, holistic health coach and self-proclaimed wellness enthusiast, here to meet you at the intersection of physical and mental health, the exact location where optimal wellness lies. This podcast is meant to explore all areas of mind and body wellness, designed to offer you the integrative knowledge, behavioral strategies, and mindset shifts necessary to uplevel your health and feel better today. We'll explore nutrition, sleep, movement, self-care and stress management, habits and routines, gut health, mental health, and more. I am so happy that you're here. Welcome to the table. Let's eat. All right, so let's lay the groundwork a little bit. I have notes for this episode. I have an agenda to some extent because I want to be sure that I'm very concise with all of this information because I just feel like there's a lot of different directions that I could go in with this. And so I want to be sure that I don't ramble because you know that I have a tendency. I am prone to rambling, but I'm also really driving the points home, right? I'm being really intentional about what I'm sharing, how I'm sharing it, and giving you clarity in all of this information because it can be a lot. I will also include a couple resources in the show notes for anyone who wants to do further reading on it. I have read a couple books over the course of my education, but also just within the past few months, more centered on this concept, and they have completely shifted the way that I see health. They've really influenced and inspired some of the work that I do, most of the work that I do with clients, and they're really powerful. I wish I could read them again for the first time. I feel like I feel that way about a lot of books. It's like, don't you wish you could just read it again for the first time and just be excited to read it? So I will link those in the show notes so you can access them. Also, just as an aside, my Amazon storefront is always being updated with books I'm reading, products that I love, but specifically within the world of books, constantly updating that. So please feel free to take a look at that too. I'll link that as well, so you can access that whenever you please. So, as mentioned, 93% of Americans are metabolically unhealthy, which I will explain what that means, the criteria for that in just a moment. Between 80 and 100 million Americans are navigating insulin resistance. 84% of Americans are pre-diabetic and don't even know it. 7 out of the top 10 causes of death for Americans are chronic disease, and most of them are tied to dysfunctional blood sugar. And 9 of the 10 leading causes of death in the US are caused or worsened by metabolic dysfunction. So this really just emphasizes and illuminates how widespread of an issue this is and how much of an influence it has on all disease, on all dysfunction, right? On the majority of what is plaguing our population, okay? Just to really emphasize the need for us to look closer at why this is happening and what can be done about it. So I want to provide the definition and the criteria for metabolic syndrome because I'm going to be referring to this throughout this entire episode, and this might be relevant to you and your circumstances, and it could also be relevant to somebody that you know, right? Maybe a parent, maybe somebody in your life, but I want to really paint this picture so you can understand what qualifies someone to be metabolically unhealthy. Okay, so Dr. Casey Means, she's the author of Good Energy. I will be referencing this book throughout most of the episode. It's also linked in my show notes because it's a powerful, powerful book, and I reference it, I use it. It's such an important book. So please feel free, if you're interested in this at all, go ahead and purchase that book, or I don't know if it's on audio, like an audio book yet, because it was just released in May, but highly, highly recommend. So when it comes to metabolic syndrome, she refers to these markers as just being our check engine lights, right? When it's a check engine light and we see it on our car, this is referencing that there is something awry within the system, the functioning of the vehicle, right? Oftentimes we can still drive the car, right? It's not like a tire has fallen off or the engine won't start. It's simply just an alert that says, check this area of the car, right? Like check the functioning of the engine, check the, tire pressure, check this, check that. But all of like the general functioning of the car is still operating, okay? And this is very similar to these markers that I'm about to list out for you, because we can still function and we can still live our lives having these markers, but they are indicative of dysfunction underneath the surface. And they must be addressed, right? They must be addressed in order to prevent it from becoming something that's more serious or influencing another area of our health or just continuing to promote inflammation and so forth. So Dr. Casey Means refers to a number of different markers to identify what's going on with your metabolic health. These markers include blood sugar, triglycerides, high-density lipoprotein or HDL cholesterol, blood pressure, and waist circumference. These markers are very common, right? They're part of, the markers that you would check on an annual, blood work panel. And we'll talk more about optimal range versus conventional range, which differs. So I want to be sure that I touch on that slightly. But what happens when we refer to metabolic syndrome is one or more of these markers reflect abnormal, reflect dysfunctional. And when it comes to metabolic syndrome, we're referring to the fact that our cells are struggling to get their jobs done because there's some sort of issue within energy production, right? That's our metabolism. When we eat something and our cells utilize the food after it's been broken down to create ATP, there's some sort of dysfunction that's going on there within that system, within our mitochondria, the powerhouse of the cell, if you remember biology in like 7th grade, right? That's promoting these issues, okay? And we're going to see that reflect then in some of these numbers. So if we were to break down metabolic syndrome, this is defined as having 3 or more of the following markers, okay? A fasting glucose of 100 milligrams per deciliter or higher, a waistline of more than 35 inches for women and 40 inches for men, HDL cholesterol less than 40 milligrams per deciliter for men and 50 milligrams per deciliter for women, triglycerides of 150 milligrams per deciliter or higher, and a blood pressure of 130 over 85 or higher. Okay, so as I mentioned, these markers are very typical, right, of your average doctor's visit, a full metabolic panel, a full blood panel. Like you'll more often than not see these numbers show up in just your average blood work. It's not something that you have to request in addition, right? So most of us have access to these numbers if we have in any point within the past year, say at our annual visit, or maybe more recently, we've seen our healthcare provider and we've had blood work done. This, I would encourage you to take a look at your numbers and take a look and reflect on the comparison that's there and see where you fall. And I think most of us can agree. We know at least somebody in our lives that has high blood pressure, that has high cholesterol, that has high blood sugar, right? Or maybe they have diabetes, maybe they have these issues. Keep that in mind because this is going to be relevant throughout this whole conversation in terms of what can be done about addressing these issues through nutrition and lifestyle that can make a profound difference on the numbers, number one, but also on preventing progression of this dysfunction that will eventually potentially create disease. And some of these diseases include, and this is from the literature, reduction in your risk of heart disease, many of the leading forms of cancer, stroke, Alzheimer's, type 2 diabetes, and liver disease. And studies show that 70% of people with heart disease and 80% of those with Alzheimer's have dysfunctional blood glucose levels. Okay, so just to put it in perspective that there is in fact a connection here, and even further, a lot can be done in terms of what we're doing from a lifestyle perspective to prevent the development of these issues. I also want to disclaim that I am not a medical doctor and this is not medical advice, right? This is simply giving you resources to better understand what this means, the prevalence of this issue, the connection and the research between our metabolic health and chronic illness, and empower you in taking control and authority in your health, which is a primary focus of every single one of my episodes. That is one of my biggest missions through the podcast, through my work with clients, is to empower and inspire you to take your health into your own hands. I also want to take a moment to share that a lot of this dysfunction can also drive up issues in other arenas, right? We're not just talking about chronic illness. We can also look at metabolic health and metabolic dysfunction and the inflammation that can come from that, and the relationship that's there in PCOS, in infertility, in digestive issues, in depression, in chronic fatigue. And what's fascinating is we're seeing these issues manifest in different stages of life because of how much of an issue this is across all demographics, right? Across all ages. For example, we're seeing skyrocketing rates of non-alcoholic fatty liver disease in younger populations, and we're wondering why this is happening, right? Because fatty liver disease is most commonly found in those who overconsume alcohol, or maybe those who have an alcohol issue, right? And then we're seeing this now show up in younger populations, in 10-year-olds, in 12-year-olds, and we're baffled by this, but it makes a lot of sense because of the influence that sugar has on our liver. Metabolic dysfunction and these issues that are compromising our cells' ability to function properly, it's inevitably going to touch a multitude of areas within the body if our body is not functioning in the way that it needs to on a cellular level, right? And that is exactly what's happening here. So I really want to be sure that you understand the comprehensiveness of this issue, how important it is for us to consider the impact that it's having on maybe pre-existing conditions that we have, or how maybe it's driving these issues, right? And take initiative in understanding your body better in order to make a change, in order to address these issues, in order to heal. All right. Now, I couldn't possibly get into each and every one of these diagnoses or these conditions and speak on the relevance between metabolic health and PCOS, or metabolic health and autoimmune, or metabolic health and depression and so forth. But for your sake, if this is something that you are navigating, I really challenge you, look into it, read about it. Understand the mechanism behind it, because the more that you know, the more you can educate yourself, and then the more you can do to make a change in addressing within your specific circumstances. So let's talk about insulin, and let's talk about insulin resistance. Let's talk about how this is one of the biggest hormonal issues that we have in our country, and let's talk about the mechanism behind all of this. All right, so in the most basic terms, when we think about our insulin response and how our body utilizes glucose, this is where a lot of the issue lies. All right, when we consume carbohydrates, whether that's refined carbs or sugar or any type of carbohydrate, our body breaks down these carbs into glucose. All right. And glucose is meant to be used for energy. Now, upon breakdown of this glucose, right, this signals to the body, specifically to our pancreas, to release insulin, and it acts like a ferry boat. Okay. So I want you to imagine a ferry. I think about the ferry in Weehawken, New Jersey, because that's the only ferry that I've ever been on. But I imagine this ferry, and it takes you from Weehawken, New Jersey, across the river, I believe that's the Hudson River, and brings you to New York City, right? I don't know where in New York City, but it brings you over to New York City. And then the ferry boat returns to Weehawken, and the cycle continues all day long, back and forth, okay? So when we think about insulin, it's acting in a very similar way. It's taking the glucose from our bloodstream that we've now consumed and shuttling it into cells to be used for energy. Beautiful, right? Lovely. Let's hope that this system is optimally functioning, because that's what we want. However, when too much glucose is present in the bloodstream, because of our highly refined diet, the standard American diet, which is loaded with all sorts of refined carbohydrates and more, the body has a hard time keeping up with insulin production, okay, because the demand for it becomes greater. And this results in blood sugar remaining in the blood, hence high glucose or high blood sugar, right? And insulin becomes less responsive to the demand. And this can create insulin resistance, all right? Mark Hyman gives a quick tip on how to identify insulin resistance, so I'll share it with you. Check your waist to hip ratio, the measurement around your belly button divided by the measurement around your hips. If it is greater than 0.8, you likely have insulin resistance. Now, I think there's a lot of other things that we can be doing to identify this, but this was just a quick way that Dr. Mark Hyman suggests we can kind of take a look at this. Unfortunately, we're eating 75,000% more sugar than what our ancestors ate, okay? And this is quite literally in the driver's seat of our obesity epidemic, insulin resistance, and chronic disease. So I'm going to rapid fire share with you what too much insulin can result in, okay? If we're pumping out this insulin to keep up with the demand of glucose, there's going to be excess insulin, right? So this can result in fat storage. It can result in an increase in appetite, all right? This is a really wild concept that we have learned more about in terms of, how our appetite and appetite regulation is impacted by this issue, by obesity. There's an increase in LDL cholesterol as well as a decrease in HDL cholesterol. Okay, there's an increase in triglycerides. There's an increase in blood pressure. Now, this all sounds very familiar, right? Because we just talked about how metabolic syndrome is defined as an increase in these specific markers. What's also really fascinating, that insulin resistance causes 50% of all cases in high blood pressure. All right, I think a lot of times we demonize salt for high blood pressure, and I won't get too much into this, right? But 50% of all cases are impacted by insulin resistance. Okay, so it's not the salt, per se, it's more the sugar, right? It increases the likelihood of blood clots. It stimulates the growth of cancer cells. It increases inflammation and oxidative stress. And that's something I think we need to continue to keep in mind that's concurrent with all of this, is that alongside this dysfunction, we're seeing an increase in inflammation, which we know inflammation is the root of all disease. We're seeing an increase in that oxidative stress, right, which promotes premature aging. It promotes disease. It promotes dysfunction. Too much insulin results in aging of the brain. It increases homocysteine, which increases potential issues involving the brain and the heart, as well as autoimmunity. We want to check our homocysteine levels. I myself am very conscious of my homocysteine levels because what I've learned through my genetic makeup is my body has a harder time clearing homocysteine from the blood, so I really need to be intentional about what I'm doing to support this process because of that challenge. Too much insulin impacts our sex hormones, and it leads to mood disturbances. So it's evident that there are a number of issues that can come along with elevated blood glucose, with insulin resistance, and so forth. So really understanding how, as we know, the whole body is interconnected. The whole body, is going to function as a whole being. And so when there's dysfunction, we have to assume that dysfunction will then also occur within the whole body, right? If we're functioning as a whole body, if we are healthy and all our systems are doing what they need to do, that is ideal and that's optimal. But the flip side, the alternative to that is all of the things that I just mentioned, right? Dysfunction that is touching all the areas of the body as a result. So why is this happening? Let's talk a little bit about why this is happening, because I think in order for us to really make a change, we need to understand what are the influences that are promoting these issues. Now, I spoke on carbohydrates, and I think we all, especially if you listen to this podcast, we all know that a large part of the standard American diet is highly processed, and a lot of it includes refined carbohydrates, and we are eating a lot of these carbohydrates. And so we're really lacking that macronutrient balance that's essential. We are consuming far too many refined carbohydrates, and this is obviously promoting lots of issues within the body. But something else that also I think is taking place is this overconsumption of calories. And I think what's happening, and this is a really important concept to consider, is the fact that we are over-consuming calories, but we're not getting nutrition from them. We are overfed and undernourished. And what is important to consider here is the fact that our body is so dysregulated in understanding how to feel full. This is impacting our hunger hormones. So when we're eating all of these processed foods and we're not actually giving our body nourishment, we're promoting dysregulation of our ghrelin and our leptin, which tells our body that we're full versus we're hungry. And we're also not giving our body what it's looking for, right? So our cravings are through the roof. Our hunger feels, like it can't be satiated, right? And this is causing us to reach for more. And not to mention, right, as I mentioned before, there's research behind obesity and increased appetite and how our body is just physiologically craving more, and we're feeling this level of, being ravenous and not feeling satisfied. And it's a vicious cycle that's really hard to step outside of, right? For people who feel like I simply just can't get enough. I can't eat enough. And I think part of it has to do, generally speaking, with the fact that we're eating empty calories. We're eating foods that are devoid of the nutrition that our body needs. We're not eating enough fiber. We're not eating enough protein, which will help to satisfy us. And there's a number of influences here. So really understanding how a lot of these ultra processed foods, which 70% of the calories that we're eating in our country are ultra processed foods, is driving up this overconsumption. And then it's also promoting dysfunction within the body, which is furthering that need to eat, right? Furthering that increase in appetite, our cravings, and the cycle continues. So it's really valuable for us to understand this from the bigger picture, because I think for the most part, and I empathize with you if this is the case for you. I think a lot of times we place blame on ourselves for not having enough self-control or not feeling like I have enough discipline or whatever the case is around food. And I think this really is just a byproduct of a dysregulated hormone system around our hunger hormones, number one. It could be just the nature of having too much sugar, which is a very addictive in nature. And I think there's a number of influences that are driving our, like I said, hunger, our cravings, and so forth, which makes it so much more challenging to feel in control to make healthy choices. Okay. And this is something that really needs to be worked on with this in mind. Otherwise, we can put a lot of blame on ourselves. We can feel like it's impossible to lose weight. It's impossible to get healthy. It's impossible to feel control around food. And that will lead to a very unhappy life, right? How miserable, how hard that must be for someone to navigate that and to feel like they don't have control in this arena. And I think it leads to a lot of disordered eating and more. Okay, so chronic overnutrition, we eat approximately 20% more calories than we did 100 years ago. And I think it's a lot to do with all of these mechanisms that I just mentioned. So really understanding what can be done about that, I think, is one of the first and foremost approaches to addressing these issues. But we'll get more into the nutritional side of things later on. Another that kind of piggybacks off of this first one is nutritional deficiencies. Now, I talk about this concept so often because this promotes all sorts of dysfunction, but as much as half of all people in the United States are deficient in at least some of the critical micronutrients. I would argue that it's significantly more than that, okay? We're simply not getting the nutrition that we need from the diet we're consuming, and also, even some of the most healthful foods are simply just less nutritionally dense than what they were several years ago because of the quality of our soil. And our soil is impacted, and this is really important to consider because, like I said, you can be eating the most healthful diet and still maybe not be getting all of the nutrition that you need to optimally function. And this is going to impact mitochondrial dysfunction, okay? This is going to be an influence on how our body is able to optimally function and function properly. Some of the important micronutrients involved in mitochondrial function include selenium, magnesium, which we know magnesium, I've shared time and time again, nearly 70% of us are deficient in magnesium, zinc, and B vitamins. All right, so this is a really important concept to consider, that nutritionally speaking, on top of the fact that we are over consuming calories, the nutritional perspective or the nutritional piece to the puzzle, not only from a macronutrient perspective, but also a micronutrient perspective, is important to consider. Nextly, we have the microbiome. Issues with our microbiome are going to impact our body's ability to function properly, okay? When our microbiome is imbalanced, this keeps the mitochondria from being able to signal and function the way that it should. What's fascinating is our microbiome, when it's functioning the way that it should, when our microbiome is healthy and diverse, these bacteria produce postbiotic chemicals that travel into our body from our gut and are important for, as mentioned, signaling and protecting the mitochondria in a number of ways. So you can imagine that disruption in these postbiotics can then create disruption in mitochondrial function. Sedentary living and a sedentary lifestyle. We know that there are a number of issues with this, but especially as it relates to mitochondrial function. Dr. Casey Means shares that movement is a powerful signal to the cells that they need to produce more energy for the muscles to do work, and as such, physical activity has a relationship with stimulating the function and number of mitochondria in cells in a positive way through the upregulation of several genes and hormonal pathways. Additionally, exercise stimulates our body to generate antioxidant replacement molecules. When we're sedentary, we have less protection from free radicals, which can then damage the mitochondria, and the positive signals for the mitochondria are absent, leading to worse mitochondrial function. And even further on the topic of physical activity, muscle mass is one of the primary ways that we can support a healthy insulin response and a healthy level of insulin sensitivity, which is the goal. We've been talking a lot about insulin resistance, and the goal is not to be insulin resistant. The goal is to be insulin sensitive, and that means that our insulin response is functioning the way that it should. And muscle mass and developing muscle and practicing resistance training and strength training is one of the very best ways to help our metabolism and to support a healthy insulin response. So on top of just general physical activity, prioritizing muscle growth and muscle mass is one of the very best ways to support this area of your health, your metabolism, and more. So some of the other contributors to mitochondrial dysfunction include chronic stress, medications, over-the-counter medications, and so forth, sleep deprivation, environmental toxins and pollutants, artificial light and circadian disruption, and this concept of thermoneutrality, which is exactly what it sounds like. We've really mastered stabilizing our body temperature. I heard someone say the other day, in this heat wave, I want to be in my air-conditioned house, then go to my air-conditioned car and get into an air-conditioned office or restaurant or whatever it was, then back into my air-conditioned car, and then back into my air-conditioned house. And so this idea of really neutralizing our body temperature is inhibitory in some ways, because the swings in temperature and, similar to what you would experience in a cold plunge or a sauna, actually has benefit for our mitochondrial health. So in the modern world, we've really eliminated those swings because we've been able to stabilize and maintain certain temperatures throughout the day. This is the same thing with light, right? Temperature and light are two of the most powerful ways to regulate our body, and we've really eliminated the need for them because of the way of the modern world. So something else to consider, but I want to be able to spend time exploring some of these concepts and these influences to mitochondrial dysfunction, because we can actually change a lot in terms of how we live our lives to better support our functioning, support our metabolic health, and so forth. So really, it's pretty clear, while I wasn't able to get into every single one of these influences, it's pretty clear that a large array of lifestyle factors influence our health in this way, influence our mitochondrial function, influence our metabolic health. And so really understanding how we can use it to our advantage and to support our health is really valuable. I first, before I get into those specifics, want to talk about blood work and looking at optimal ranges versus conventional ranges. So I'm just going to rattle off the comparison, and I encourage you to, I'll link it maybe in the show notes, a document for you to look at that compares the functional versus the conventional, the optimal versus conventional, because a lot of times these numbers differ. And I'm sure you've experienced this, or maybe someone in your life has experienced this, where you go to the doctor, you're not feeling well, you don't feel healthy, for, lack of a better word. And your doctor says, oh, well, your labs are all normal. You're fine. And you're on your way. You're like, but I know that something's not right here. I know that I don't feel right. I know that I don't feel healthy. And so for the sake of this episode, I'm really just focusing on metabolic health. But for the sake of any other blood work that you get done, I want you to look into it further and compare your numbers to what a more functional, optimal range might look like. Because I think a lot of times we fall within what's considered the normal range, which is oftentimes much wider than maybe an optimal range. And would you like to be normal, or would you like to be optimal? That's really the question that I'm asking you. And so if you look at those numbers and you notice, yeah, well, within a conventional range, I am considered normal, or maybe I'm at the higher end or the lower end of what's considered normal. But then if I look at these numbers through an optimal range, which is oftentimes much more condensed, you'll notice, okay, wait, maybe this isn't necessarily optimal, and what can I do about it in order to get myself into that range? Okay, rapid fire. Let's talk about functional ranges and optimal ranges versus conventional ranges. So, when it comes to triglycerides, what's considered normal by standard criteria is less than 150 milligrams per deciliter. The optimal range is less than 80 milligrams per deciliter. The research behind this says that the probability of a cardiovascular event, like a heart attack and stroke, is 50% less in people with triglycerides under 81 milligrams per deciliter versus in people with levels between 110 and 153 milligrams per deciliter. Nextly, let's talk about cholesterol. Range considered normal by standard criteria is greater than 40 milligrams per deciliter for men and greater than 50 milligrams per deciliter for women. Now, when we talk about the optimal range for HDL cholesterol, there is a U-shaped relationship between HDL levels and development of diseases, with both low and very high levels being associated with increased risk. The sweet spot for lowest risk appears to be about 50 to 90 milligrams per deciliter. Now, there's also another hack that I want you to consider, and it's the triglyceride to HDL ratio. And so if you're able to calculate your triglyceride to HDL ratio, you can better understand your insulin sensitivity, your level of insulin sensitivity. Dr. Mark Hyman says that ratio, dividing your triglycerides by your HDL, is the best way to check for insulin resistance outside of just the insulin response test, which is pretty fascinating. Research shows that the most powerful way to predict your risk of a heart attack is by this ratio. If the ratio is high, your risk for a heart attack increases 16-fold or 1600%. So calculate this ratio, like I said, by simply dividing your triglycerides by your HDL, and anything above a ratio of 3 is strongly suggestive of insulin resistance. Your goal is to shoot for less than 1.5, although lower than 1 is better. All right. Aiming for less than 1 is what's recommended by the research and so forth, but this is a quick way to really better understand where you fall, and understanding that ratio can then let you in on more information about where your body's at and what areas might need more support. Now we can talk about fasting glucose. The range that's considered normal by standard criteria is less than 100 milligrams per deciliter. Optimal range is 70 to 85 milligrams per deciliter. And this is really, really important. They actually say that one of the better markers to use is fasting insulin. This is actually going to tell you a whole lot more outside of what fasting glucose can offer you in terms of information about your levels of insulin resistance and so forth. And this is not standard in terms of what you will get when you request these types of tests, and doctors might push back. So asking for your fasting glucose as well as your fasting insulin is something that I recommend, and looking more into the difference there, what that means. If there is a large amount of insulin just hanging out, right, because you are getting a fasting insulin test, we learned just before about what too much insulin can lead to, how that influences the body. So you can imagine that this is going to bring value to your understanding of what's going on underneath the surface outside of just what traditional tests are going to offer you. When it comes to blood pressure, the standard or conventional range is the same as the optimal range, and that's 120/80. And then as far as waist circumference goes, the range that's considered normal by standard criteria is less than 40 inches for men and less than 35 inches for women. And the optimal range will vary based on your ethnicity. So that's something that you can look into on your own to really determine where you fall based on your background. But these are just some of the markers that I want you to consider. Now, like I said before, I'm not a doctor. I never come off as being one, right? But I feel compelled and I feel called to share the differences here just so you can better understand what you're looking at as it relates to your blood work. I had for many years low vitamin D. I had other issues that were reflective in my blood work, but I really didn't know, number one, to even look at my blood work, but also to understand how to interpret it. And we expect our doctors to do that for us. Now, they do, especially when we're thinking more up against the conventional normal ranges. But when it comes to these optimal ranges, we have to do that work. We have to look a little bit closer and understand what's considered conventionally normal based on the standard population and what's considered optimal in order for me to achieve optimal health. So let's dive into the remainder of this episode, really exploring nutrition and lifestyle as it relates to metabolic health, mitochondrial function, and so forth. There's a lot of different things that we can be doing on a daily basis that help support this area of our health, this foundational part of our health, and it's through what we're eating, how we're moving, how we're sleeping, and so forth. So one of the very first suggestions that I can make to you is to reduce and or eliminate the amount of refined sugar and grains from your diet. I can assure you that just doing this alone, you will notice a profound improvement in how you feel emotionally and physically on a day-to-day basis if you start to monitor and reduce how much of these foods you are consuming. And this takes time, especially if this is a predominant part of your nutrition, especially if you're still learning what it means to identify these foods. Because I think a lot of times when we think sugar, we immediately think about granulated sugar, or we think about cookies and cakes and ice cream, which yes, very much sugar. But we also forget about all the other areas that sugar is hiding in our yogurt, in our condiments, in our cereals. I mean, across the board, there's sugar hiding in so many places. So once we really take the time to better understand where sugar is hiding and how to identify it when we're grocery shopping and the foods that we're eating and more, we already take so much control back as it relates to our health. So much control. Okay, so that would be my first and foremost suggestion. I also recommend reducing and or eliminating refined oils, vegetable oils, canola oils, soybean oil, oils that are largely inflammatory and are impacting our mitochondrial function, impacting our metabolic health, and more. So if we are able to relinquish refined grains, refined oils, and refined sugar, already we are doing so much to support our mind and our body, and obviously our metabolic health as a result of that. You will almost immediately notice an improvement in your energy levels, in your focus throughout the day, in your ability to get good quality sleep, in the stability of your mood, and more. Okay, so that is one of the best things. Now, I'm not typically the type of person that promotes elimination or restriction in any way, but this is a conversation I think that needs to be had when it comes to our metabolic health, is really examining the relationship that you have with these foods and the presence of them in your life, and being honest with yourself about how infrequent or how frequently you're consuming them. How to start making swaps to better support your health, because nowadays there are a lot of options out there that are better for you, more anti-inflammatory, less disruptive to your body and functioning and so forth. And, as you start to learn more about the influence that they have, I hope that inspires you to make a change. And so, like I said, I'm not someone who's going to promote restriction or eliminate or avoid, or you can't ever have these foods again, because I think balance is really important. But for the sake of what we're trying to discuss here from the lens of metabolic health, that is one of the primary things that you can do to better support your health, your metabolism, and prevention of disease. Now, on the flip side of that, one of my most favorite things to encourage you with is to consume more micronutrients and antioxidants. And this is coming from the real whole foods, plant foods, animal-based foods, and so forth that are abundant in this type of nutrition. Now, we learned at the beginning of the episode that deficiencies in essential micronutrition like magnesium, B vitamins, and so forth all play a role on our metabolic health and impair our mitochondria from doing what they need to do. And then antioxidants, which personally I just love antioxidants. Antioxidants are exactly what the name says, right? They fight against oxidative stress. So when we have free radical damage within the body, which is driven by sugar, driven by toxins, driven by stress, driven by all of these very real influences in the modern American world, we need antioxidants to our defense, right? We need antioxidants to fight against this oxidative stress. So the more that we can incorporate more micronutrition just for overall health and functioning, but especially as it relates to mitochondrial health, and also antioxidants to reduce inflammation in the body and so forth, the better off we'll be from a metabolic perspective. Just to give you a few examples of this more specifically, the micronutrient vitamin D, super important. This reduces mitochondrial oxidative stress. It enhances the expression of insulin receptors and glucose transporter channels. Magnesium facilitates ATP synthesis by participating in the reactions that produce and utilize ATP. Magnesium reduces oxidative stress and enhances activity of mitochondrial enzymes. It regulates glucose and fat metabolism by activating enzymes involved in glucose uptake. Selenium serves as a cofactor for antioxidant enzymes. It enhances expression and activity of insulin signaling proteins. B vitamins participate in various steps of energy metabolism, such as the breakdown of glucose before entering the mitochondria, the production of ATP in the mitochondria, and the synthesis of fatty acids and amino acids. Then there's the antioxidant vitamin E that enhances insulin signaling. CoQ10 acts as an antioxidant by protecting against free radicals and reducing oxidative stress. It improves glucose metabolism and insulin sensitivity, and so forth. Now, even if you don't know what any of that means, and that's just a few of the examples, it still drives the point home that a wide array of nutrition, micronutrition, and antioxidants is essential for supporting your health, supporting your metabolism, supporting your mitochondria, supporting insulin sensitivity, acting as cofactors or catalyst for certain processes within the body, and more. The list goes on. All right, so one of the very best things that we can do is incorporate a wide array of color, different colored produce, fruits and veggies, nuts and seeds, incorporating lots of animal-based protein and animal-based products are great ways to incorporate a lot of valuable nutrition, very bioavailable nutrition. And really prioritizing real whole foods as often as possible will ensure that you are getting in a wide array of nutrition, a wide array of these antioxidants and so forth in order to optimally function. Now, in addition to this, we want to be sure we're getting enough omega-3 fatty acids. And omega-3 fatty acids are coming from foods like fatty fish, chia seeds, walnuts, flax seeds, oysters, things of that capacity, which we're simply not getting enough of. We are getting plenty of omega-6 fatty acids, and this is coming from all the oils I mentioned before, and a lot of our baked goods, a lot of our packaged foods are all made with these oils, which is what's driving up the inflammation within the body. And not only that, it's disrupting the balance between our omega-3 and omega-6 fatty acids. There's a balance that happens within the body, an essential ratio that's there. And ideally, we would be at a 4-to-1 ratio, omega-6 to omega-3. But nowadays, within the standard American diet, we are upwards of 25-to-1 when it comes to omega-6 to 3. So I want you to consider this in relation to your own life, what types of oils you're using, what types of foods you're eating, and identify how is it that I can incorporate more of these omega-3 fatty acids into my life. I will link the supplement that I personally use to add in more omega-3 into my life on top of what I'm getting from food. If you're interested, you can go that route. But omega-3 fatty acids are, in essence, ultra anti-inflammatory. And when it comes to understanding this in relation to our metabolic health, we know that chronic inflammation is a big piece to the puzzle of metabolic health. And so any kind of inflammation that's happening within the body is going to impair our body's ability to function properly. So just as a general health suggestion, I'd like to look at omega-3s as being WD-40 for the body. but they're also key in our cellular and metabolic pathways. So consuming them through the foods that we're eating is essential. And unfortunately, like I said before, a lot of us are just not consuming these foods as regularly. And I don't think we understand the repercussions that come along with it when we are deficient in these omega-3s. And this is coming from a gut health perspective, especially a mental and a brain health perspective, a heart health perspective, and now we know a metabolic health perspective. So I want to touch now on fiber and the importance of consuming enough fiber. And this goes back to what we were talking about as it relates to the microbiome and mitochondrial dysfunction and how important it is for us to have a flourishing microbiome, which we know is important for a number of things from a gut health perspective, but especially as it relates to these postbiotics that the bacteria in our gut are producing when in fact they are happy, they are healthy, they are thriving, they are balanced. But not only that, this is going to be another strategy that I suggest to you, and I think it's really important because we're talking more general suggestions for metabolic health, but I also want to talk about how important it is to create a balanced plate. So while we talk about fiber, which we're going to get from a lot of plant-based foods, that's really what I want you to focus on when it comes to fiber intake, is increasing the amount of plant-based nutrient-dense foods, which also contain a lot of fiber. We want to talk about creating this balanced plate from the lens of having protein, fiber, and fat. And even further, we can suggest adding on leafy greens to that equation, because what we know about leafy greens is they contain a lot of micronutrition, which are really going to help with insulin sensitivity and so forth. Now, if you want to learn more about this, I highly recommend looking into Kelly LeVeque, and she talks all about this. She refers to it as the Fab Four and how valuable it is for our metabolic health. So I'm going to reference it here, but highly recommend checking her out because she's a plethora of knowledge, and this is really her primary focus when it comes to health and wellness in terms of her work, in sharing this framework by which she operates. So really the primary takeaway that I want you to consider here is to never eat your carbs naked. I am not one to demonize carbs. I think we do a really good job of that in our culture and diet culture. I believe that all macronutrients have value in some form or fashion. Some people argue, well, we don't need carbs to survive. Other people say, carbs are our body's preferred source of energy, right? Like there's a lot of mixed messages around our macronutrients. And not to mention, obviously, what I just spoke on when it comes to micronutrition, but especially when it comes to macronutrients. And what I believe is we should all consume our macros in balance. Now, maybe one person has different needs than the other. I'm not going to get into counting macros or anything of that nature. But when it comes to building your plate, this is one of the best tools, and this is one of the primary tools that I teach clients because it's a framework that can be applied in any setting as long as you are familiar where each food falls as it relates to, is it protein, is it fat, and so forth. So when we're not eating our carbs naked, that means we always want to dress up our carbs alongside other macronutrients. So when you're building your plate, I want you to be sure that you have a source of protein on your plate, you have fiber on your plate, you have some sort of healthy fat, as well as if you choose a carbohydrate, okay? And when you're consuming your food, I want you to be sure that you are consuming your protein and your fiber first. Your fat may just already be a part of your protein option or your fiber option, given the fact that maybe you cooked your, sauteed spinach, or you sauteed your spinach in avocado oil, or maybe you added some dressing or some sauce to your protein. And then if you have a carbohydrate on your plate, have that thereafter, okay? And what we know is the impact that this has on the way your body breaks down the food is enormous. I'll pull this from one of the books that I just finished up. It states that according to the researchers, the effect of this sequencing is comparable to the effects of diabetes medications that are prescribed to diabetics to lower their glucose spikes. A startling study from 2016 proved the finding even more definitively. 2 groups of type 2 diabetics were given a standardized diet for 8 weeks and asked to either eat their food in the right order or eat it however they pleased. The group who ate their food in the right order saw a significant reduction in their HbA1c level, which means they started reversing their type 2 diabetes. The other group, eating the exact same food and number of calories, but in no particular order, didn't see an improvement in their condition. So by just addressing the order by which you consume your food and how you build your plate can have an enormous difference on how your body responds. And the mechanism here is if you're consuming your starch or your sugar, your carb, whatever the case is, and you consume that first or you consume that alone, it's broken down super quickly in the body. And this is going to create that blood sugar spike. Now, we know from the beginning of this episode, we talked about how when our body breaks down carbohydrates, it turns into glucose. And when we're eating foods that are refined, whether that be a refined sugar, refined grain, whatever the case is, we're going to see an increase in our blood glucose pretty quickly. And we're going to see that spike. And what we know is what goes up must come down. And this is where the issue lies, right? Is the fact that we're having these spikes and these crashes, and that's causing a lot of issues, both in terms of how we feel in the immediate term, and then also over time, this is really dysregulating and damaging to our body's functioning. Whereas if we choose to have, say, our broccoli or we have our chicken or whatever the case is, first and foremost, before having our pasta, before having our bread, whatever it is, it actually slows down that process because we're laying that foundation first by giving your body fiber and protein before adding in that carbohydrate. And it's actually going to slow down that process of breakdown as opposed to having it in isolation. So it's recommended that we start with our fiber, our protein, and our fat because it has minimal or little to no impact on that blood sugar curve versus starting with your carbohydrates and then proceeding from there. Now that is such an easy hack to implement no matter what your meal looks like. And not only that, protein and fiber are 2 of the most satisfying macronutrients. They are the most satisfying macronutrients. So I think what you'll find is instead of loading up on your carbohydrates first and foremost, which aren't going to give you that level of satisfaction, you'll find that you're feeling satisfied much quicker in terms of what you're eating, and this will lead to lessening your likelihood of overindulging or overeating because you're eating the macronutrients that are going to help you feel most satisfied first and foremost, which are also, in my personal opinion, some of the more nutrient-dense options on your plate, right? Which isn't always the case, but for the sake of just generally speaking, the nutrition that you're getting from these plants, from the protein and so forth, are really nourishing, are really valuable, really fueling. And you're going to feel that level of satisfaction, and you're not going to feel a temptation to consume more than maybe your body needs. So coming back to our original concept of talking about fiber, I mentioned how important those postbiotics are, like butyrate, acetate. Those are really, really important for improving insulin and glucose levels, for supporting a healthy gut, regulating metabolism, even regulating hunger and appetite, and having an anti-inflammatory effect on the gut and in the body. Not only is fiber essential in this regard, but it's also just important for a healthy gut. And if our gut is not healthy, if we're having issues within our microbiome, with our gut lining, we're also more predisposed or have a higher likelihood of having malabsorption or having issues with nutritional deficiencies. Because you aren't what you eat, you are what you absorb. And if your gut is not absorbing the nutrition from the food that you're eating or the supplements you're taking, you are not really taking advantage of the nutrition that you are thinking you are consuming. So as a result of this could put you at a heightened risk for nutritional deficiencies. And then, as we know from the beginning of the episode, this can influence mitochondrial function, metabolic health, and so forth. Now, I also want to mention that so many of us are simply not consuming enough fiber. The USDA's dietary guidelines for Americans state that over 90% of women and 97% of men do not meet the recommended daily intake of fiber. Now, the average American's consuming 5 to 15 grams of fiber. We should be on upwards of 40 to 50 grams of fiber. So if we know about the importance of fiber for our gut health, the relationship between our gut and our metabolism and mitochondria, okay, the importance for fiber for a healthy microbiome so that we can utilize nutrition and absorb it most effectively, and then how this plays a role in supporting a balanced plate, you can better understand how valuable it is for us to be intentional about our fiber intake. And not only that, when we talk about fiber, we're referring to plant-based foods. And what did we learn about plant-based foods and nuts and seeds and fruits and veggies and the value of micronutrition and antioxidants coming from these foods? All right. So really driving this point home, how valuable it is for us to consume more fiber, be really intentional about it, but also from an order of events perspective, as I mentioned, the value of prioritizing your fiber and your protein on your plate before diving into your carbs. That can be a daily practice that you implement to better support your glucose levels and more. So speaking of the gut as well, you want to be sure that you're consuming a wide array of fermented foods, which we know are loaded with probiotics. Probiotics are our good bacteria, and in order to have a diverse array, a diverse population of probiotic bacteria within the gut, we need to be supporting it in this way. So just as an aside, be sure you're consuming fermented foods. If you feel like you need to supplement with a probiotic, you can also do that too. There's a couple brands that I can recommend to you, but just in general, good gut health means whole body health, means metabolic health, and having a diverse and nourished and flourishing microbiome is one of the first ways to do that. Okay, so we spoke on protein a little bit, but I also want to call protein back into the conversation because of how valuable it is for metabolic and physiological health. Okay. Adequate protein is essential for our muscle mass too. And as I mentioned before, having adequate muscle mass is critical. I was at a loss for words there. I couldn't even find the right word I wanted to say. Essential, critical, imperative, fill in the blank, whatever word drives this point home, use that word because it is so essential for improving insulin sensitivity. And that is something that's just not talked about enough. So really prioritizing resistance training and strength training alongside adequate protein is one of the best ways to reverse insulin resistance, to address your metabolic health, and to support energy within the body. It's also essential for body weight regulation, which we know obesity and waist to hip circumference and all of these factors play a role in metabolic syndrome. So we know, as mentioned before, that obesity and satiety and that connection is really important to consider. As I mentioned, protein is the most satisfying macronutrient. So as a result of including more protein in your diet, you will notice a reduction in overall calorie intake, which, as mentioned in the beginning, this is a big driving force in mitochondrial dysfunction, is we are overfed and undernourished. We're consuming a lot of calories, but we're not consuming adequate nutrition alongside that. So by fueling with adequate protein, you'll notice not only a stability in how you feel throughout the day because you're stabilizing your glucose levels, because we said that starting your meal with protein and fiber is one of the best ways to do that, but also you're going to feel a level of satisfaction that's going to prevent you from feeling like you need to overeat and overindulge. And what I've also heard time and time again from clients is their sugar cravings largely reduced by increasing their protein. And I would even go as far as to say they disappeared, right? Not just reduced, they really eliminated them just by being intentional about incorporating more protein. Dr. Casey Means explains that certain amino acids and proteins have a stimulatory effect on specific satiety hormones like GLP-1. And what we know about GLP-1 is this is, the big conversation around Ozempic and the mechanism behind that, right? So really understanding how much of an impact you can have on your body and your health just by bringing your attention to the value and the power of real whole foods. I cannot stop saying this. I will repeat myself 100 times over and over again until this message is made clear to you that incorporating real whole foods, protein, fiber, fat, micronutrition, antioxidants, and more, our body knows what to do with these things, right? Our body knows how to function properly if given the resources in order to do so. So if you're able to incorporate more of these things, you will notice a shift because your body is intelligent. Your body knows. It innately has these systems set forth. We're just not giving our body the tools that it needs to function optimally. Okay, so now that we explored the basics of nutrition, the areas that we want to focus on in terms of loading our plates with real whole foods, adequate protein, lots of fiber, micronutrition, antioxidants, and so forth, there are a few skills that you can also implement or strategies you can implement over the course of your day that will really help to stabilize your blood sugar. And this is imperative for really anyone, whether you are navigating your diabetes or you are just familiarizing yourself with your metabolic health and what that means. There are a lot of strategies that you can implement through your day that are going to help tremendously. So first and foremost, as I mentioned, don't eat naked carbs. Whenever you're building a plate, whether it's a full meal, a snack, be sure you're getting adequate protein, be sure you're getting fiber and fat, and pair your carbohydrates with something of that nature to help stabilize your levels. In one study, consumption of about 20 grams of protein and 20 grams of fat about 30 minutes before eating carbohydrates significantly decreased post-meal glucose elevation in both non-diabetic and insulin-resistant individuals. Now that's pretty powerful. Just simply prioritizing protein, fiber, fat alongside your carbohydrates can have a significant influence. Now, I'm not going to say that you can then use that as justification for, okay, I'll have my chicken breast and I'll have my broccoli and then I will have 6 donuts, right? Obviously, you want to use judgment here, but it can be a really easy skill for you to implement or a strategy to implement in order to support your body over the course of the day. One of my favorite hacks is always choosing a salad before a meal. Now, this is one of the best things that you can do if you're eating out at a restaurant and you have limited choices or, you're about to have that penne vodka, right? Have yourself a green salad before your meal. This is going to give your body the fiber. And even further, if you add a vinaigrette to it, vinegar actually has been also effective in managing glucose levels, whether you're having vinegar 20 minutes before a meal or within 20 minutes after a meal. But having a green salad, you're getting that fiber in and you're getting leafy greens in, right? Which is a double whammy. You're getting 2 for 1 here. So having that before your meal can actually set the tone and set the foundation so that if you do have a meal that's maybe more carb heavy or whatever it looks like, right? You're set and ready to go, having some of that fiber to satisfy you, to set the groundwork so that your body receiving those carbs has a different impact in comparison to having the carbohydrates alone. As I mentioned, vinegar, the compound acetic acid that's found in vinegar has been well researched, and this goes for any vinegar, whether it's apple cider vinegar, white wine vinegar, whatever the vinegar of choice. I love apple cider vinegar because I think it has other benefits outside of this, but it actually has been shown to dramatically impact our glucose levels. So if you know you're going into a meal that you're about to have a whole lot of carbs, or maybe it's off of your normal routine, whatever the case is, having I almost said glucose, having apple cider vinegar diluted in water, 1 to 2 tablespoons diluted in water beforehand, can actually really help to mediate the impact that those carbohydrates or that meal will have on your blood sugar. So I don't necessarily like this as kind of like an excuse to then go overindulge every single day. Like I said before about the donut example, it's more just about, okay, if I am navigating insulin resistance or I am trying to be more conscious of this because I'm about to have a heavier, higher carb meal, I'm going to prepare my body to receive that meal in a more productive way. So 1 to 2 tablespoons of your preferred vinegar. I personally like apple cider vinegar, either 20 minutes before the meal, which is ideal, or it still can be as effective 20 minutes following the meal. Another strategy that you can incorporate, which is one of my personal favorites, is using the glucose that you consume after your meal or putting it to work. So incorporating some sort of movement after a meal, they say even up to 70 minutes, I believe the research says that it's effective in going for a walk or doing 20 squats or doing some push-ups, whatever that movement looks like for you, however you can make it happen, is actually going to significantly help your body in response to the food that you just consumed, because you're using that and putting it to work and forcing your muscles to do something with it, okay? So my personal favorite is going for a walk after a meal. I think we've all probably been in a situation where it's been a holiday. I'm thinking about like Thanksgiving or Christmas, or, a day where you have maybe a lot of food, or the meal is just exceptionally big, right? There's just a lot going on, which, 'tis the season when in Rome, as it should be, right? And you're either the family that goes for the after dinner walk, or you're the family that sits on the couch and watches football and dozes off, right? But you can notice quite a big difference in how you feel if you go for a walk versus you just sit on the couch. You tend to get drowsy. You tend to kind of, sink into that post-meal experience, versus if you were to go for a walk, you're going to actually probably feel a lot more energized because you're supporting your blood sugar in this way. So if you don't believe me on this, go experiment, okay? Make it a priority to walk after your dinner, say for a week, and then maybe try not walking after dinner for a week and see the difference. I assure you, you will notice a big difference. All it takes 10 to 15 minutes. All right, doesn't take much, but get your body moving, take advantage of, the opportunity to support your digestion as well. And I think it can actually make you feel a lot better, but also supports your glucose spike as well. Another piece to this puzzle, which I'm sure you can imagine there had to be some influence here, is sleep deprivation and circadian rhythm functioning, okay? We have to consider how so many of our health concerns are coming from the fact that we're not sleeping properly, first and foremost, but also our circadian rhythm is so dysregulated and disrupted by the way of the modern world, and we've lost touch with what our basic biology needs in order for it to optimally function. And once we really prioritize this, we can actually regulate our system in a number of ways, but also just overall improve our quality of sleep as a result of it, right? So many of these issues are coming from the fact that our diets are poor, we're not moving our bodies enough, right? Our light exposure is all over the place, and it's really creating a lot of dysfunction in this innate process, in this innate balance that exists within the body, and that's driving up issues, in a number of different ways. So let's talk briefly about sleep and its influence on our metabolic health. So there's research that reflects in mice the fact that sleep deprivation, long-term sleep deprivation, actually destroyed the structure of mitochondria. So just that alone, right? Need I say more to that? But clearly there is dysfunction that's coming from us not getting enough sleep. Not only is sleep deprivation impactful in this way, but sleep deprivation is also extremely stressful. And what we know about stress is being in a space of stress, if we're thinking about it from this primitive response, which I've talked about a number of times before, our body releases cortisol during times of stress. And the release of cortisol also signals to the body to release glucose, right? Glucose is stored in the liver, in the muscles of our body. And during times of stress, when our body's under the impression that we are in a space of danger, that there's a threat and we need to fight or we need to flee from the situation, our body is going to innately release glucose into the bloodstream so we have quick access to energy, okay? Because we need to run or we need to fight, and that requires a lot of energy. So when we're sleep deprived, okay, this is very stressful on the body. Not only that, if we have dysregulated cortisol, that's going to impact our blood sugar, but also stress and the importance of stress management. And this, unfortunately, is just not talked about enough. You know how I feel about this. But if we think about the cycle of stress, okay, not only is psychological stress really influential because it's going to trigger the release of cortisol, which is going to trigger the release of glucose into the bloodstream, which is going to create high blood sugar. And then also, if we think about the stressors that we don't commonly think about, which includes processed foods, sedentary living, environmental toxins, what did we just learn about all these things? Also incredibly stressful, also incredibly influential on our mitochondrial function, on our metabolic health, okay? So you can see how all of this is just the combination and the cumulative impact that these pieces to the puzzle have on our metabolic health and our mitochondria's ability to function properly, and how one influenced the other. It's kind of like what came first, right? The chicken or the egg. In this case, it's all influential. It's all interrelated. And so really identifying what feels relevant or what is relevant to your lifestyle and your circumstances can give you at least a starting point to start to untangle how complex a lot of this is, right? How one drives the other and the other drives the one, right? It's all interconnected. It's all interrelated. Now, as it relates to our circadian rhythm, what we know is our body is exposed to light through our eyes. The light signals to the suprachiasmatic nucleus that it is in fact daytime or it is in fact nighttime, right? This is a pivotal part of our circadian rhythm, our internal clock. And as a result of this synchronizes, essentially orchestrates so many hormonal and physiological processes that are responsible for our body to function properly. As I said before, light is our master regulator, and our exposure to blue light, artificial light, at times where we're just biologically not meant to be exposed to it, is disruptive to not only our quality of sleep, but all of these systems that depend on this regulation of light in order to tell our body what time it is, what we should be doing at this hour, and so forth. So Dr. Casey Means refers to this as irregular photic signals, which means experiencing light during naturally dark times, i.e., at night, scrolling on social media, or being indoors when it's light outside, because most of our time during the day is spent indoors, right? We're always inside. We never go outside. All right. So this is contributing to disruption and disturbances in our metabolism, as well as an increased risk of all sorts of dysfunction related to our stress levels, our digestion, hunger, which, as we know, is going to contribute to metabolic dysfunction. So, as an aside, one of the best ways to combat this is to get your morning sunlight, expose yourself to the sun in the morning, try to get as much sunlight over the course of the day, and then in the evening, really be intentional about monitoring your light exposure. All right, this is one of the best things that you can do to support your body, utilizing light in a way that it's meant to be used, utilizing it to our advantage. All right, and not only that, right, if there's sleep issues going on or you feel like you have sleep disturbances of any kind, insomnia, whatever the case is, addressing the root of that across the board. I think all of this goes hand in hand, but it can have a profound impact on our body's way to function properly, especially given the fact that sleep is such a pivotal, critical time for detox and for recovery. And so if our body's not able to do that, think about how disruptive our body's functioning is in general over the course of the day if we don't have the sleep from the night before to do the job that it needs to do to prepare for the next day. All right? Once again, all interrelated, all super valuable, and the more you know, the more you can do about it. And not only is sleep in general really important, but the quality and the quantity and the consistency of it is also so important. I want to read this excerpt from the book Good Energy to really drive that point home. The impact of poor sleep consistency has also become clear through research on the health effects of daylight savings time, where an entire population is forced to shift their sleep and wake time by 1 hour twice a year. Research has shown that these bi-yearly shifts are associated with increased heart attack, stroke, hospital admissions due to arrhythmias, missed medical appointments, emergency room visits, inflammatory markers, high blood pressure, car crashes, and mood disorders, as well as changes in gene expression, including clock genes. The American Academy of Sleep Medicine has released a position statement advocating for getting rid of seasonal time changes, as this 1 hour shift appears to incur significant public health and safety risks and misalignment between the biological clock and the environmental clock. That's insane. Right? What a profound influence this can have just by an hour, the impact, the increase in health risks, and so forth, just based on this, slight shift in functioning, which clearly is having a profound influence on our health and more. I also want to just briefly touch on meal timing, and I think we have such erratic patterns and I can't even call them patterns necessarily because they're not patterns, right? We just have erratic schedules when it comes to eating that not only is it disruptive to our sleep because we're eating well into the night, but it's also really important to consider the influence that this has on metabolic dysfunction. So Casey Mean says erratic daily food patterns and ultra-frequent food intake predispose us to metabolic dysfunction. And research actually shows that practicing something like time-restricted eating, intermittent fasting can actually really have an impact on our fasting glucose, fasting insulin, and so forth. And so this is something I think that doesn't always work for everyone, but really understanding the impact that this can have on our metabolic health by giving our metabolism a chance to take breaks between eating. This is actually something very normal for us, especially in terms of our ancestors. Our ancestors didn't have access to food the way that we do, right? Our ancestors biologically had breaks between meals and weren't able to eat all hours of the day and, throughout the course of the day. And so it's actually very healthful. And there's a lot of research to support taking breaks and having windows of time where you are restricting the body from calories, and it actually can improve your metabolic health as well. I want to also touch on movement because I know I've mentioned it briefly, but there's so much value as it relates to our metabolic health and movement. I mentioned muscle mass, so I really encourage you to make that a primary part of your movement routine, no matter your age, no matter your experience. Start with where you are, but building muscle mass is one of the surefire ways to support insulin sensitivity and support the body in utilizing glucose more effectively, and then also just supporting a healthy body weight and supporting overall health and supporting your body composition and more. Okay, it is one of the best things that you can do, but also just the fact that we are just unfortunately so sedentary. This is inevitably influencing our metabolic health. Our metabolic systems, they function best when regular, consistent movement is a part of our lives. Okay. And this, I think, is a really important piece to the puzzle because while we can prioritize a workout in the morning or a workout in an evening, right? Which is oftentimes what most of us do. Oh, I go to my workout class. If we're then sitting and we're sedentary for the remainder of the day, this is actually not as effective as just simply making movement an integrated part of your day to day. Like getting up and, walking around your neighborhood or getting up and walking your flight of steps, maybe, 3 times through your workday. Getting in a walk in the morning and a walk at lunch and then going to your workout class in the evening. We are not meant to sit still, and we are sitting far too long, and that is the problem. I think the research says that the average U.S. adult takes 3,000 to 4,000 steps per day, whereas our ancestors were taking 20,000 steps a day and spent less than 10% of daily hours sitting. Now, obviously, the circumstances are different, right? We aren't the same beings as we were then. We had different responsibilities, right? Our safety was at greater risk. We had to hunt and gather our food, right? There was a lot of other things that were happening. But that's what's going to be most valued to our innate biology is aligning as best we can with the behaviors that our ancestors engaged in. Now, is it realistic to get 20,000 steps a day? Probably not. But it's certainly more realistic to get more than 3,000 steps. And that's just really unfortunate that is the reality. Okay. So I encourage you to make movement just an integrated part of your day as best as you can. It might be a work in progress. It might be something that you have to get comfortable with. Maybe some days you'll be more effective at it than others, but we're sitting far too much and it is wreaking havoc on our metabolic health as a result. And we're seeing this in the increase in obesity. We're seeing this in the increase of all of these issues that are contributing to metabolic syndrome. And if we were to just move a little bit more, a lot of that would shift for us. And not only that, I think I want to just further emphasize, it's also sitting, okay? It's not just about movement, it's about sitting that's causing lots of issues. That's promoting inflammation. That's promoting metabolic dysfunction. That's promoting this oxidative stress in the body. Okay. So we can move our bodies and make that a priority. But if you can offset and work towards eliminating sitting as much as I sit at my desk, whether that's by getting a standing desk or setting an alarm and getting up every 30 minutes and walking, around your home, or getting a walking pad. One of my clients just got a walking pad and I'm so excited for her, right? Offsetting and minimizing how much we're sitting, because nowadays you could literally never leave your couch and fully function. Convenience is the name of the game nowadays. We have to work against that. Just because it's an option doesn't mean that we should go with it. And we have to be proactive in reducing how much we're sitting because of what influence that has on our health. Okay? So move your body more, incorporate more regular exercise, make it an organic part of your day, and also try your best to eliminate how much you're sitting and get up and move throughout the day. I'll give you this statistic real quick about walking, okay? Simply walking about 10,000 steps per day as compared with lower amounts is associated with the following: 50% lower dementia risk, 50 to 70% lower risk of premature death, 44% lower risk of getting type 2 diabetes, 31% or more lower risk of obesity, significant reductions in cancer occurrence, major depression, gastric reflux, and sleep apnea. And there are no medications and no surgeries out there that offer the same impact that prioritizing that step count can have on the body in relation to prevention of chronic disease. There is a quote that I love that if exercise could be put in a pill, it would be the most widely prescribed medication for all diseases. That's incredible. Okay, if that's not incentive, I don't know what is. So get moving, prioritize a high step count, get walking, go for more walks, go build your muscle, do all the things, and I'm here for you if you need support. And last thing I'm going to touch on are toxins. I think that this is something that's not explored enough within the world of health, and I want to be sure that I touch on it briefly. So when it comes to the toxins that we're putting on our skin, toxins in our food, toxins in our water, you can imagine that this is going to have a disruptive impact on our metabolic health. It's going to drive up oxidative stress, drive up inflammation. So the more that we can be aware of this and the more that we can choose non-toxic options as often as possible or prioritize healthy detox pathways, which is something that I'm really big on, the better off we'll be. Okay? I don't want to spend too much time here, but I think, just really understanding that we are exposed to toxins and our body takes on a lot of stress as it relates to these toxins. And this is going to inevitably impact our mitochondria's functioning. A lot of times, when it comes to obesity, when it comes to toxins that are stored within the body, it can make it much more challenging to lose weight as a result of that. And really just doing your best to eliminate the impact can have profound influence on how we feel, our metabolic health, our body's ability to function, and more. For anyone who's interested in learning more about that concept about obesity and toxins, you can Google obesogens and it'll give you all sorts of information on what that means, the impact of it on our health and our, body composition and so forth, and, what we can do about it as a result. I think what is really important to consider here is the fact that these chemicals, these toxins and so forth are really impacting us in a number of ways. They're impacting our gut health. They're overburdening our liver. They're disrupting our hormones, right? And all of these issues can contribute to dysfunction across the body and, no exception, our metabolic health as well. And it's not just toxins and chemicals, it's also preservatives in the foods that we're eating and artificial dyes and things of that nature that are coming, from our processed foods, our standard American diet, right? And so it's really important that we're considerate of this kind of multifaceted influence that it has on our health and our metabolic health and what we can be doing actively to reduce exposure, to reduce consumption of these toxins as well to support whole body health and especially metabolic wellness as well. And as I mentioned, stress and managing our stress and practicing good self-care. I don't think I talked about this, but I want to be sure I do additionally speak on this. Stress is going to drive up our inflammation. It's going to promote the oxidative stress. It's going to contribute to mitochondrial dysfunction, okay? It's going to impact our body's ability to function the way that it needs to. I mentioned before, it's going to contribute to high glucose levels because of the mechanism that's meant to keep us safe, right? But it's actually chronically activated, so it's chronically creating high blood glucose levels, and it's also contributing to worse metabolic biomarkers, okay? Chronic stress is associated with obesity, lower HDL, increased visceral fat, larger waist circumference, and higher blood pressure, okay? As well as higher LDL, higher heart rate, insulin levels, and triglycerides. So just understanding how much of modern American life is impacting our health, so incredibly important for us to take initiative to really step foot in the right direction to addressing these issues and preventing disease from unfolding down the road. So this is where I'm going to conclude today's episode. This was quite the episode, quite the unfolding. I am certain I didn't get to touch on everything that I would like to touch on, so there will be continual conversations around this topic, but I wanted to just give you the overview of the importance of this, the relevance to all of our lives. I think when it comes to blood sugar and understanding what that means, it is something I think a lot of times we write off as just being relevant to someone who is diabetic, and that is simply not the case, right? This is all an innate part of our metabolism, of our physiology, and so the second that you're able to understand how important it is and how much of an influence it has on both physical and mental health, the second you're actually able to make an enormous difference in how you feel from day to day, long-term health outcomes, and more. So if you have questions for me on this, please don't hesitate to reach out. I will continue to share more on this topic, both on Instagram, on TikTok, and then I will also likely be sharing more episodes around this topic. I know there's a lot of information, and I want to be sure that I'm covering it and I'm giving it the credit and the acknowledgement that it's due, to really emphasize its importance. And I hope that you are able to take away a lot of strategies and just a greater understanding of its role in our health, in our wellness, and what you can do as soon as today to better support the body in this way. Okay? So thank you so much for being here. As always, it is such a pleasure having you at my table, and until next time, be well.